we're hearing less about the nuclear capabilities and the ballistic missile requirements. And it's all now about blockades and counter blockades and who's going to blink first, essentially, to let the ships through the strait.
It's interesting. I've talked to a few analysts this week on both sides of the aisle who say this is a prudent move. President Trump is actually dialing down the rhetoric a bit and allowing a bit of space for negotiations.
Any sort of agreement on Iran, especially if China as a participant, lets the White House kind of divert attention away from the conflict in Ukraine.
Hey guys, great to see you again.
Yes, here we are, and still in the midst of an on again, off again war or hot phase or ceasefire or all of the above at any point in time, it seems.
And I think this week in particular was kind of odd because we really didn't know what was going to happen at the beginning of the week. There was a looming deadline, and then a suggestion that JD Vance and everyone would head to Islamabad, and then at the last minute that didn't take place. I think it was like a even for this White House, it was a kind of a very fluid and fast moving first couple of days of the week, which I feel like
There
I
was
say a lot, but
there was confusion over when the deadline even was, wasn't there? Was it Tuesday night? Was it Wednesday night? It seemed to be changing based on who was speaking at any particular time.
We've had a few of those moments during the course of this war where you have this kind of crescendo of activity and this deadline, this cliff peak, and then we reach it. The same with President Trump's threat to end the civilization of Iran, which then ended up with that deadline being extended or a ceasefire being announced there. So, yeah, it has been again one of those weeks, and also one where I think President Trump, although he's been active on Truth Social, we haven't seen as much of him this week, where he's been commenting publicly on camera in front of the media, with taking questions directly on Iran. And I wonder, it's interesting. I've talked to a few analysts this week on both sides of the aisle who say this is a prudent move. President Trump is actually dialing down the rhetoric a bit and allowing a bit of space for negotiations. Whether that's the case or not, that remains to be seen. But at least that's how some people are reading it.
Because we're hearing from Iran, aren't we, that they are getting close to a point where maybe something could be discussed, and then the president posts something or says something which they perceive as a threat. And I mean, we've had various statements now from members of the Iranian regime and officials saying, we're not negotiating as long as these threats are being made against us and our country.
I also think though that by extending the ceasefire for an indefinite period, he's actually created a situation for himself in which he has a lot more flexibility than if we were dealing in 2 week increments. As things stand, this could go on for a very long time, and during that time, of course, there's still a blockade in place on Iranian ports, and Iran is still being kind of choked off from global financial markets. Whereas Trump, has more flexibility to let those things happen, and then hopefully pressure Iran to come with a unified proposal, as he called it, to the negotiating table. I think, even a few people I've spoken to who were very critical of this war kind of said that this approach is perhaps the most prudent decision Trump has made since Operation Epic Fury began back in February.
It's also been recast almost this week as a battle over the Strait of Hormuz, hasn't it? I mean, we're hearing less about the nuclear capabilities and the ballistic missile requirements, and it's all now about blockades and counter blockades and who's going to blink first, essentially, to let the ships through the strait.
Which is interesting because the strait, of course, was not an objective before the war started. It was
Exactly.
open before the war started. But in that sense, President Trump in the past has talked about who holds the cards. Remember that infamous meeting that he had with President Zelensky in the White House, where he said, "You don't have the cards, you don't hold the cards." The White House, in the messaging that we've heard this week, is clear that they see themselves as holding the cards right now with their counter blockade on Iranian ports. I thought it was notable that Caroline Levitt said a few times in this one press briefing this week that the president is satisfied that they have this stranglehold over the Iranian economy, that they're not allowing Iran to be able to benefit from getting its own oil out of its own ports, and that indeed is putting enough pressure on Iran economically that the U.S. comes to the negotiating table, should there be further talks, in a much better position. And previously, Iran really was able to have the upper hand in the strait.
I mean, I think also one thing important to note is that reopening the Strait of Hormuz is like a verifiable strategy that they can actually see is working. I mean, that and perhaps the nuclear issue, that's something that the world can kind of prove and verify is actually working. Whereas, kind of the missile and drone capacity or Iranian support for proxy militias in Lebanon, for example, or Iraq or Yemen, that's much harder to kind of put into practice and enforce it. So I think also the Trump administration kind of shifted focus because of that, because those things is less hard to show that something has been achieved, whereas an Iranian commitment to not manufacture a nuclear weapon or about enrichment and the strait being open. I mean, that's the most verifiable of all because ships will
Mm.
be clearly passing through and the global economy will kind of react to that.
One foreign policy analyst, though, and a close watcher of Middle Eastern affairs, put it to me that this was kind of a win for Iran, a very tiny one, but moving the conversation to being about reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and exactly your point, Bernd, about it's, a quantifiable and visual issue, and when it's resolved you can tick it off the box and it can be checked and seen. It doesn't require going into the bottom of mountains with special expert teams trying to see if there's enriched uranium there. But this person was putting it to me like the fact that Iran has managed to shift the conversation to that point, away from everything that it was at the beginning, is kind of a bit of a win for them, because the focus now isn't so much, at least not in the short term publicly, on getting in and seeing what they have, how close they are to having a nuclear weapon. I mean, just a few weeks ago, we were hearing from the president and the administration about this imminent threat, saying that Iran was 1 week away, at one point was said, from having a missile that could reach the US, which there isn't evidence for, even from within US sources. There isn't public evidence for that. So the shift in the discussion also brings up the point of who can wait the longest here. The US and Iran can wait pretty long, but can the rest of the world? Can those in Europe in particular are feeling the pinch here? The broader global economy as well, watching to see what happens here. So the pressure might start to come on from outside actors as well.
I think it's interesting also that the messaging shift that we've heard from the administration is also that the Iranians need to come together with a unified response, basically saying that it is the Iranian regime that is fractured and scattered and cannot put together a unified negotiating position. And speaking to our colleagues at BBC Persian, they say, one, of course, this is the same regime as it was before, just with a different person, a different supreme leader. But secondly, to depict it as a massive rift between the IRGC, between somebody like the parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Ghalibaf, who has been a key part of, as we understand, talks via Pakistan with the US, is not necessarily accurate, because this is a unified position among mostly hardliners. Even Mr. Ghalibaf is considered, of course, himself also a hardliner. And so if the US says this is about ensuring that every part of the Iranian regime knows, one arm knows what the other arm is doing, that is a messaging shift that might not necessarily work out in the long run for the Trump administration.
It's also very different than what he was saying kind of towards the end of the major combat operations when he was saying that Iran's several tiers of Iranian leadership had been killed and a new kind of more reasonable faction had come into place. I mean, at that point, he was making no mention of hardliners. He seemed to suggest repeatedly that the hardliners were gone either through US or Israeli strikes. And so, I mean, that shift in conversation, I think, was kind of very abrupt in a way. And I think, looking back on this conflict in the future, I think the White House might wonder whether he was very premature in saying that the hardline elements of Iran's regime had been killed, and then having to reverse course, saying that there's now a debate between hardliners and pragmatists in the Iranian government.
And again, BBC Persian colleagues have been pointing out to us that in that first round of talks in Pakistan, the fact that Ghalibaf brought, what was it, 60 or 70
Yeah.
people with him, for that exact point that you're making, Sumi, there, about showing that united front. So nobody's able to go back to Iran and say, oh, well, I wasn't for that, because he can say, well, you were in the room. We
Yeah.
all were in agreement. We all went there. We all heard the same things. And we all are for this or against it. But what's kind of remarkable is the timelines that we're still dealing with here. I mean, that first round of talks was a day. There's, discussions as we're recording here about when the next round of talks might be. But when we think back to the previous deal, which Donald Trump threw out, that President Obama agreed, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I mean, I remember reporting on that for about 2 years. Those talks were going on, somewhere 20 to 24 months of time. It's not a deal that can get done in a day or a week or even 2 weeks. So I think, it was smart on the part of President Trump to put this indefinite. It gives him that opt out option, but also he's not being tied in to 2 weeks for something that, and we've had some of them on our programs who were involved in those
Yep.
JCPOA negotiations. I mean, they speak about how intricate the discussions were, how every word is weighed over, how you have to have so many technical experts from both sides going over the logistics of what might be involved, what's acceptable to one side, not acceptable to the other side. So the idea that that would happen in a day or two, according to those who've literally been in the room before, is just not a realistic prospect.
I think also one of the main differences with the JCPOA was that was more of a global effort than any sort of unilateral discussion
Yeah.
between Iran and the United States, because there was the P5+1 countries. China was there, Russia was there, Germany was there, France, the UK. All those countries are very notably absent from this discussion that may or may not take place in the near future between the US and Iran, nor is Israel, importantly. And I think Israel is obviously the other big factor here. So I think, I mean, that's kind of a main difference, in that there was more kind of global buy-in to those negotiations. Even if countries will be very happy once this conflict is over and there's some sort of deal, they really have no participation whatsoever in what is being discussed or in the outcome.
Yeah, it really has been a key point of President Trump, hasn't it, to bash that JCPOA agreement, and he often name checks President Obama when he does so, and that's a line that we heard from Republicans at the time and continue to hear from. I've spoken to Republican lawmakers who have said that was a terrible deal, and President Trump can get a much better deal. And yet, I found it interesting that in some of the messaging we've seen from President Trump's posts on Truth Social, some analysts have pointed out it seems in a way he's possibly setting up public expectation for getting a deal that might be somewhat similar. The Iranians, according to the people I've spoken to, including those who have negotiated in the room with them, are not likely to completely reject their nuclear enrichment, what they see as a right to nuclear enrichment. It is unlikely, as we've seen from the messaging as well, that they will allow the U.S. to come in and get what President Trump calls a nuclear dust. So the nuclear materials that are under what he says are the beautiful B-2 bombs that were dropped during Operation Midnight Hammer in the summer. And the Iranians have been quite clear about that. And I was looking back at the JCPOA, and it restricted Iran from enriching uranium past 3.67% until 2030. Just looking at that point, there was a ban on plutonium production, blocking both uranium and plutonium pathways. There was expanded access and information rights for inspectors as well from the IAEA, which has obviously been a big point, because once that deal was ripped up, that meant inspectors couldn't go in and have the same access that they did. And yet, one of the big criticisms has been, of course, that that deal did not dismantle Iran's ballistic missile program. Remember that that was one of Israel's biggest complaints at the time, and that there were these sunset clauses that Iran could start enriching uranium at a higher level after a certain number of years. And those are the points that I keep hearing from critics of that deal as to why they believe President Trump can get a much better deal. But I'll just add that I spoke to the former Secretary of State, John Kerry, who, of course, had a big role in negotiating those JCPOA talks. And he said, look, the breakout time, so the time between when Iran could break away from this agreement and build a nuclear weapon, was 1 year. That's what he said. And that means that if there was any indication that Iran was about to build a nuclear weapon, we had 1 year to carry out negotiations to stop that from happening. And he has said that that clearly is something that, was a big benefit of that agreement.
And the other part about all of that, which was discussed all those years ago, and what's on the table again now, is the issue of sanctions being lifted as part of the deal. And it's interesting that, this is what's being discussed between the US and Iran at the same time that the EU is actually leveling more sanctions on Iran. And, just this week reached a political agreement to level sanctions on anyone blocking the Strait of Hormuz. Because, in a way, when we're talking about the blockade happening there, I mean, there are international norms about maritime freedom and freedom of passage and the laws of the sea and so on, which many of the other countries that aren't direct parties to this conflict are very upset about and very vocal about changing. So, there's it just, again, when he's CCing everything that was in that JCPOA and that breakout clause, which is something that President Trump was deeply opposed to.
Yeah.
His reason for getting rid of it was like, if we see they are ready for a nuclear weapon, why would we have a year to talk about it? Why
Yeah.
wouldn't we just sort of take action straight away? So, the point here of all the other countries that aren't party to these talks just begs the question of what happens next. And, if a deal is done in weeks or months, how then does that impact the rest of the world? And, Pakistan acting as the go-between here, is it doing so with the approval of China? They obviously have a very close relationship as well, and how is any deal sold to the rest of the world?
I think that the China aspect is interesting because also, I mean, the other way to see that is that several former Pakistani officials have given an interview that China actually kind of creates a limiting factor for what otherwise has been kind of a tremendous PR victory for Pakistan, both in terms of their relationship with the Trump administration, which has been improving, but also, the just plain flattery. I mean, Pakistan nominated Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize, something he feels strongly about. They're very enthusiastic participants in his board of peace. But then, I mean, their proximity to China kind of limits how close they can actually get to the Trump administration, which I think is going to be an interesting uh, trend going forward to see how that plays out.
Especially with President Trump, of course, heading to see Xi Jinping in China. I've heard, a few analysts say to me, look, a lot of President Trump's moves right now are calibrated towards that meeting. He really is looking towards that as a really critical meeting, not only for the US-China trade relationship, but for ensuring that there is, global economic stability again, and that they come to the table with some sort of leverage on China. And that is weighing on in the back of the minds of, many in the Trump administration, understanding how critical that meeting will be.
I mean, it really sets up a situation where President Trump and President Xi could be together, potentially announcing some kind of peace deal in Iran, doesn't it? Or
Mm.
at least a stopgap measure related to the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, we're just a couple of weeks away now from that meeting, and we know how conscious President Trump is about the optics of these things, and we know how much he likes to speak about the other conflicts in the world that he claims to have solved. I mean, this would really give him an amazing thing to talk about on a world stage, standing there beside the Chinese president.
And I think any sort of announcement like that would also kind of ease the what the White House might see as the remaining challenge of Ukraine and Russia, which doesn't seem any closer to being solved. And in fact, the Ukrainians are very upset about the easing of sanctions on Russia with regards to the oil. And I think any sort of agreement on Iran, especially if China as a participant, lets the White House kind of divert attention away from the conflict in Ukraine to a certain regard. It's something Trump hasn't really been speaking about much at all since this began, and I think it's really notable. To my knowledge, no one from the White House has publicly acknowledged that Ukrainian technology has helped in the defense against drones and missiles, or that know-how was passed along from Ukraine to the US and its Gulf allies. I think it's a really notable absence of what they've talked about during this conflict.
To the dismay of the Europeans, of course, who
Mm.
were hoping that President Trump will refocus his attention on Ukraine once the war in Iran is over. Obviously, it's not over, and negotiations will take some time. And for the Ukrainians, they have, of course, provided an important service with their anti-drone technology, as you said, but President Trump and his administration are so consumed with everything that's happening in Iran. And the point's been made to me a few times. Look, it's not necessarily that there is a lack of focus on the war in Ukraine. It's simply that if you have one set of negotiators, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who are dealing with on a number of fronts, and this includes Gaza as well. Of course, they haven't moved into phase 2 of that ceasefire agreement. That is partly, in a way, what's holding up ending the war there. But that only tells half the story, of course, and the other half is the fact that you have really entrenched positions in this war, and Vladimir Putin has refused to stop attacking Ukraine.
I think it's convenient for this administration as well to be able to use those points you mentioned, Sumi, about, one set of negotiators and so on. Because even before they launched this offensive in Iran, we were hearing so many loud soundings from the president and
Yeah.
his team about wanting to pull back and step back from their support of what was happening in Ukraine. And even since the US and Israel started striking Iran, we've heard the president complain many times in the context of NATO and other European allies, not as he sees it coming to help with Iran. And he says, well, we came to help you. We came to help Ukraine. You're not coming to help us. Why should we do that? That's not our war, or words to that effect. So I think we're seeing a very strong set of signals being laid there. About the lack of further interest at this point. And, this president and his team like a win, and it doesn't look like any win or any kind of peace deal is coming anytime soon in relation to Ukraine and Russia. That's as entrenched as it's ever been in many ways. And so I think that you see again this week the European Union launching a 20th package of sanction measures on Russia, still very much keeping that spirit alive. The change in leadership in Hungary, meaning Viktor Orban's not there anymore. They were able to approve the loan deal for Ukraine as well. That the European Union is sort of taking a position of, yes, the US is preoccupied with Iran, but also its attention may not come back this way. So
Yeah.
we need to continue doing this for ourselves.
I totally agree with you that I think the White House came to a conclusion that it wasn't a win. And I mean, at the same time, it really wasn't that long ago when we were here discussing the possibility of a second meeting between Putin and
Mm.
Trump in Budapest. I mean, that wasn't that long ago at all. And I think when that went away and the focus went on Iran, the White House kind of came to the conclusion that one is achievable and one is not achievable, at least in any sort of time frame that works for President Trump. I think it's very much on the back burner, and it's not made any easier by the fact that whatever grievances Trump had with Europe and the NATO alliance are much deeper
Mhm.
entrenched now
Yeah.
than they were before Operation Epic Fury. And I think since he sees them as kind of that, working with Ukraine, he's kind of in a certain regard lost interest.
Yeah, and all the signals from the administration is when the war with Iran is over, they might be turning their attention to Cuba. So, they're not necessarily talking about Ukraine as the next big crisis that needs to be solved. But I guess we'll be talking about that in the coming weeks, and perhaps
Yep.
also about the King's visit. Of course, we'll all be consumed with the royal visit here in Washington. So that'll be interesting to watch for all of us as well.
Indeed, and that's an interesting one to watch, not just for the pomp and pageantry, but because of where relations lie
Yeah.
with the US and UK, and specifically with Donald Trump and Keir Starmer at the moment. So we'll have lots to talk about next week.
And you can catch up with all of the episodes of The President's Path on BBC iPlayer if you're in the UK.
Or on YouTube if you're anywhere else in the world.
And if you want to get in touch, you can email us at path@bbc.co.uk.